Hello and welcome to Realpolitik. This is Johny, the Hindu's International Affairs Editor. Donald J. Trump is going to be back in the White House. He proved election pundits and pollsters wrong once again to take a resounding victory in the November 4 presidential elections. He swept all the 7 swing states and won the popular votes too. The Republicans took control of the Senate and retained their majority of the House. This is a clear mandate in favor of Mr. Trump and the Republican Party 4 years after Joe Biden was elected the 46th President of the United States. Mr. Trump's first term in office was marred by controversies, both at home and abroad. He ran a campaign promising to tackle America's immigration problem, revive its economy, tackle inflation, and bring the Ukraine war to an end. Liberals attacked him as unfit to become the president, given that he was convicted in a hush money case under the Biden administration and other controversies he was involved in. And he is returning to the White House at a time when America's leadership of the world is contested by other great powers. What does this victory mean for the United States and the world? How is it going to affect the United States' relationship with India? To discuss these questions and more, I am today joined by Varghese K, author of Open Embrace, India, US Ties in a Divided World, and the Hindu's resident editor in Delhi, who was in the United States covering the election. Welcome to Realpolitik, Varghese. To begin with, how do you look at Trump's return to the White House? There are two dominant narratives about Trump's victory. One is that the United States is not matured enough to elect a woman as the president. And on the other side, they chose someone like Donald Trump, who is a convicted felon. Some call him someone with a questionable character, etc., etc. And on the other side, there is an argument that Trump's rise to power and his return to power represents deep fissures in American society and also the deep frustration which millions of Americans, particularly the working people across ethnicities, that they have with the establishment politicians and the parties. So what is your take on Trump's victory?
Well, I think we have to, first of all, take into account the fact that before Trump became president, who was the president of the United States? He was a person of African American origin whose middle name was distinctly Muslim. Barack Hussein Obama was elected president of the United States on a multicultural agenda, on a question of diversity, so on and so forth. At that time, the mainstream punditry about the United States politics was it is a post-racial society. There is no return to America being a white Christian country. That was a dominant narrative. See, it is a fact that partly the rise of Donald Trump and the Make America Great Again movement was partly inspired by the rise of Barack Obama. I have to emphasize the fact that it's partly inspired. There are multiple factors that have actually caused a kind of dissonance. As you rightly put it, this is a society more or less divided in the middle, roughly 50% of the population on both sides on a divide. The divide has two components. One is the economic aspects of that divide, and the other is the cultural aspects of that divide. The foreign policy implication or the manifestation of this divide in foreign policy also has these two components, which is cultural and economic. But the basic premise, the basic thing that we will have to take into account is a cultural and economic divide between the two sides. The Democrats, the MAGA movement has a cultural component, which is to actually, it is more a reaction in the sense that their reaction is against multiculturalism rather than a white Christian nationalism. We have to again note the fact that there is a strand of white Christian nationalism, which is very much part of the Donald Trump MAGA movement. We cannot deny that thing, that does exist there. But the reason why a significant portion of the electorate that voted for Barack Obama is turned against the democratic agenda of that era and have come to the MAGA movement, shows that the same people who could actually swing between these sides. So they're not really essentially racist or religious bigot as the narrative quite often goes. I mean, you can compare this with an Indian situation, very small digression. In 2009, the Congress was a very significant, I think it is the single largest party. Even if it is not a single largest party, it got nearly 25% of the vote seats, Lok Sabha seats in Uttar Pradesh. The same electorate actually turned into what is being termed a communal politics later on. So there is no reason, or there's no justification for accusing the voters for the choices that they make, but we have to really analyze why they behave in a particular manner. The same set of voters swing between seemingly two starkly different choices within a short span of maybe 4 years or 8 years. In this case, Trump was elected in 2016, he was defeated in 2020, and he's come back in 2024. Why? Very quickly. In 2020, though he was defeated, the analysis of that defeat by the people who were victorious was not exactly an honest introspection of what was going wrong in the United States, or what the people were finding wrong in terms of both the aspects, culture and economy in the United States. And I think they, instead of introspection, they actually went into a mode of euphoria. So therefore, this was in many ways an inevitable outcome of how the progressive political forces in the United States processed the 2020 electoral outcome in which Donald Trump was defeated.
In 2016, nobody expected Donald Trump to become the president. Most of the pollsters got it wrong. And in 2024, in the run-up to the elections, you see, most of the pollsters in the United States predicted that Kamala Harris was in the lead. And she was in the lead in most of the swing states as well. I remember having a conversation with you on November 3rd on the eve of the elections, where you suggested that it is likely that all the swing states could swing in favor of Donald Trump. And it turned out to be true. But the American mainstream narrative was completely different. Okay, everybody called it a neck-and-neck fight, and it was not even a neck-and-neck fight. But then they also expected Kamala Harris was in the lead, but the result was completely wrong. My question is, why the pollsters fail to understand the Trump phenomenon, not once, but twice?
I would say even thrice, because in 2020 also, as we discussed earlier, the way the defeat of Donald Trump was interpreted and processed subsequently was pretty not in tune with what the popular mood was. Because of the fact that he was defeated, it was actually extrapolated to argue that the MAGA movement was over. Trump was just the Trump movement was just a one-off aberration from the otherwise really progressive surge of politics in the United States. These are all totally baseless and misrepresented arguments that were actually peddled as mainstream wisdom. Now, when we come to polling, opinion polling in the United States, that is actually one slice of this overall challenge of American expertise, as we call it, the death of expertise, as some commentators have said. When your wisdom, your political arguments are based on opinion polls and the data that you are solely claiming the proprietorship or custodianship of, then you are actually bound to go wrong. Actually, very interesting manner in which the American comedian Bill Maher, who is, by the way, a Democratic-leaning, self-identified progressive, so he said the American Democrat ecosystem is something like a European old royal family, which in fear of challenge from outsiders would actually go into incestuous marriages and then creating mentally retarded offspring. So he used this very gross, dark imagery to describe why the Democrats are not in a position to intelligently process what is happening in the United States. So polls can be, I mean, we all know it's a basic common sense that you can the responses to a question in a polling will always be based on how the questions are framed without going into the technicality of why they may have gone wrong. What is happening in the US is there is, particularly in the mainstream English media of the United States, the big platforms, they have an inherent either lack of capacity or a defined refusal to engage with what people are saying, why people are saying, and they very frequently and routinely resort to name calling and dismiss people's opinion as racist or bigoted or what is actually being described by the MAGA followers as a cancel culture. If you express anything that is not exactly in full conformation with that narrative, then actually you lose the capacity to understand what is happening. And that is an echo chamber where the same stories are endorsed and reinforced, and there is a huge currency for that kind of a narrative. So they were actually missing the point. They continue to miss the point, though some leaders in the Democratic camp have now raised this question. I keep repeating this point, on both fronts, on the economic front and on cultural front. There is a deep resentment. There is a deep kind of alienation that a significant segment of the US population are experiencing. So regardless, you throwing facts at them to say that, okay, the economy has grown at this percent and American economy is been at the best moment ever in terms of output or technological advancement and so on and so forth. Those are all technically true. I mean, experts would argue. They can show you charts and they can show you graphs and they can give you the numbers and figures to make that case. But the fact of feeling, which is again, the feeling is supposed to be not accounted for because you have to go by facts and numbers and figures. But politics, end of the day, is driven by feelings, and that feeling is against the dominant consensus in the US, which used to be the dominant consensus. And there is a new consensus, I would argue, that is indicated in this outcome. And a lot of Democrats that were refusing to see that thing, I think perhaps are trying to account for that thing.
When I try to understand the Trump phenomenon, Trump is not a working class hero.
Mhm.
And Trump is being supported by Elon Musk, who is the world's richest man.
Right.
Trump himself is a real estate mogul, a billionaire who lives in his fancy estate in Florida, etc., etc. And Trump is also being, he is being accused of a lot of things. He imposed the so-called Muslim ban when he was in power last time. And he has taken a hardline position towards immigration, especially immigration from the southern border. His character is also being questioned, and he is also called a fascist. Kamala Harris herself called him a fascist, and then some of his former cabinet colleagues called him fascist, etc., etc. But still, my question is, how did he win over, let's say, the Hispanics? How did he made such inroads into the blacks? And how did he win over the working people of America?
I mean, in fact, that is the biggest paradox of American politics. The champion of all this resentment or this grievance turned out to be a person who should have been on the other side. He should have been held accountable for all these grievances that his own voters are facing. But on the contrary, what has happened is that the Muslims voted for him in largest ever number. The black African Americans voted for him in the largest ever number. The Latinos voted for him in the largest proportion ever. The women voted for him in the largest proportion ever. So on and so forth. Why does that happen? Which is actually at one level it's paradoxical and it is very complex and it defies an explanation. At another level, it actually is rather simple to understand, which is that in a two-party system, people will have to choose between the two. So these each of these individual constituent social groups that we've been discussing, whether it is the Latinos, women, Muslims, migrants, so on and so forth, all of them would consider Trump a lesser evil than the Democrats. That actually makes the failure of progressive politics even worse than the fact that you cannot, or you cannot even beat somebody as problematic and complicated a character as Donald Trump. The evangelicals who voted for Donald Trump, who may not actually qualify to be a born again Christian as evangelicals would want to perceive it. So that remains a paradox, but that also explains the major fissures within the idea of multiculturalism that the Democrats are promising as a panacea to everything, and also their inability or refusal to actually address the key economic issues that are arising out of a globalist economic model that they've been they've been the great proponents of.
The last administration, last time when Trump was in power, his government was chaotic, all said and done. There were repeated leaks in the media, in Wall Street Journal and New York Times, about what's happening in the administration. And most of his cabinet colleagues, including Mike Pence, his vice president himself, turned out to be his detractors later on. So, what do you make of Trump's cabinet picks this time? So, Trump's longtime ally Steve Bannon once said that the key objective of the Trump administration is to remake the administrative state. Let's say, for the sake of an argument, if Trump is serious about, bringing in institutional reforms, etc., would he be successful this time, or will it be a repeat of Trump 1.0?
Well, I think it is too early to expect or be hopeful about the chaos vanishing and a new order emerging. But what is clear is that we have to also just quickly look at why chaos erupts when Trump is in power, why chaos is not visible, even when that might exist beneath the surface. Like, for example, when the Biden administration was there, is there right now also. The reason is, as I said, the fundamental conflict that in the US society right now is the basic conflict between two camps. There are two ideas, broadly speaking, two ideas about what the identity, the question of self and the perception about American identity, exceptionalism, etc. There are divisions on that fundamental question. The chaos that we see in administration, or the chaos that we see during elections and politics, these are all reflections of that deep fundamental divide. Now, that division will be more visible and will be more manifest when Trump is in power, and that is a function of, again, the US mainstream media. In fact, we reported in one of our pieces during the campaign, which is that a significant majority, I think nearly 3/4 of American journalists are declared Democrats. Now, so they have a way of understanding and processing, and this conflict within the perception or the self-perception and American strategy will be manifesting in discussions around policy decisions and administrative decisions which are coming up in the new administration, and that will easily get leaked, unlike what happens when the Democrats are in power, because at that time there will be a much stronger convergence of how the media interprets it and how the administration or how the political executive figures that out. So these right now, or the incoming Trump administration will broadly likely, I mean, it runs the risk of running into the same conflict with the American mainstream media in this new term as well. So if that is the case, you will see chaos more amplified in public domain. But this is independent from the real chaos, the real conflict, which anyway exists whoever is in power. Even when 4 years of Biden administration, though there was a facade of calm and stability in administration and politics in the United States, that wasn't the case. The real conflict, the real tensions that were simmering beneath that mainstream media narrative, which is sort of erupted again during this campaign. So this time, if American mainstream media and the Democrats uh, are accepting the fact of this chaos and then try to negotiate the new middle ground, I think we will see that chaos continuing. As far as uh, unraveling the administrative state, as you described, as Stephen Bannon's famous formulation is concerned, there are attempts that Donald Trump is making at that. We are not very clear or sure about whether he has a strategy and to see it through, because it's all about details. As far as creating some kind of disruption is concerned, by the kind of nominees that he has picked for very sensitive posts, like Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard, and his pick for Attorney General, and his pick for Defense Secretary. All these, some, at least significant number of those picks actually indicates to a serious attempt to disrupt the way U.S. administration and politics strategy all is run. Whether he will see it through, or whether it will only be disruption without rebuilding or without redesigning anything, we cannot be sure. We'll have to wait and watch how that scenario evolves.
Yeah. So that is something that we have to wait and watch. Now, if you look at foreign policy, one thing that, in my view, that made Trump stand out when it comes to foreign policy was that he didn't start any war during his 4 years in power. That's a very important distinction when you talk about American presidents, because you talk about anybody, right from the Cold War period, even Barack Obama, Libya is his legacy. And Trump, at least there were 2 occasions where the United States came close to bombing Iran directly. And John Bolton, who used to be Trump's national security advisor, even recently said in American TV that in Trump National Security Council, everybody supported American strike on Iran, and Trump, said no. He was actually attacking Trump for not standing up to Iran. But I mean, the fact of the matter is that he didn't start any war. And not just that, now if you trace his campaign, which you did very closely, his vice presidential pick is a very strong critique of America's wars in West Asia, especially he had served in Iraq. So there is this anti-war, or let's put it this, isolationist tendencies in the foreign policy is taking shape under the Trump administration, which did under the Trump administration. It is taking shape under Trump's leadership. So how do you look at this angle in the future, in the upcoming Trump presidency? Because Trump is assuming presidency at a critical moment for the world, because one war is going on for over 3 years in Ukraine, and in West Asia remains on the brink. So do you think Trump can make any meaningful difference?
That remains yet another question. We'll have to see how whether Trump will have the 2 things: whether Trump will have the patience and the strategy and the tactical maneuvering capacity to implement or to push what he said he would always push. Number one. Number two, whether he will be able to outsmart or overrule the American strategic community and the establishment, which considers Donald Trump, as a challenge to their way of understanding and thinking. Now, in the last 4 years, between the first Trump presidency that you mentioned rightly about a rare US presidency, a term which did not trigger a new war anywhere, and the new Trump presidency, which is coming up in the next couple of months, you have 2, again, as you mentioned, you have 2 new wars already at play. One in Europe, one in West Asia. And we also have a situation where America has relations with with China, and a potential conflict with China on question of Taiwan or other issues higher than any other time in history. So we have two active wars, and we have an active threat of a new war. Many of American strategic experts are actually calling for or arguing for an open confrontation with China as a generational opportunity to ensure that US supremacy continues or remains intact or is reestablished in the current century. Now, among the Trump picks, while his campaign rhetoric has been very, very clear, not only that, okay, he's been talking against wars, he's actually explained why he's against wars on several occasions and interviews during the campaign. His point being that it serves no purpose. Certainly for the United States, it doesn't serve any purpose. And it is generally speaking a human tragedy. So he's made this point clear. And his vice president to be, J.D. Vance, has been very clear that so much so that he said that it is Ukraine's problem is not America's problem. So at the same time, we have to also acknowledge the fact that Trump is more anti-China than all Democrats, generally speaking. So there is a strand in him to be confrontational with China, number one, and there is also a very clear preference without any qualifiers that he is given Israel a blank check for whatever it wants to do. That was the case when he was president in the previous term, 45th as 45th, and now that he will continue into the 47th presidency that he is going to occupy again. So these two issues actually makes Donald Trump a kind of a bundle of contradiction, because on the one hand, he thinks that Israel has a right to do anything and everything, and he also thinks that China has to be confronted whatever the cost may be. Now, given these contradictions within his own positions, you have a set of advisors and a set of appointees that are already in play in Washington, D.C., who are also actually divided along these camps. Some of those people are to use that term, some isolationist, or they're not for American interventions abroad, like Tulsi Gabbard. And there are also people like Marco Rubio, who is designated as a Secretary of State, who is a hawk in every sense of the term, particularly in case of Iran, particularly in case of China, against Russia, for Israel, against Palestine, so on and so forth. So how and whether Donald Trump could actually manage, whether it is just yet another tactic of Donald Trump to actually make all these warring factions and opinions come into conflict within the administration, and then he will exercise the veto power, as John Bolton's narrative that you just mentioned says. At that point in time, practically everybody in that system wanted to bomb Iran. So, as a narrative that then reported by New York Times, the question that Donald Trump asked was, how many people would die? So he was given an answer, I don't remember how many. So it was in few hundreds, if not thousands. And at that point, the story goes that he said no bombing. So whether he will continue to use that kind of judgment, or he has changed his view because of changed circumstances, whether it is Russia or Israel or China, we do not know yet. But I think that for the world, more than what will happen in the United States in terms of domestic politics and transgender politics, I think these questions will be of much higher consequence for the world in general, and including India.
Where does India stand in the Trump world? You have written a book about India and the United States, referring to the previous Trump term, open embrace. So now that Trump is going to be back in the White House, where does India stand?
Well, I think overall, in terms of bilateral understanding, bilateral ties alone as a silo, I think the mix of things would be weighing in India's favor. Why? I would argue that because Trump has a favorable opinion, or at least it may be purely tactical and transactional view of his overall civilizational, cultural, political agenda. He considers India as an ally or a partner in the broad sense of the term. But he's mentioned India as a country that is actually trying to exploit loopholes in American trade and tariff system, so on and so forth. That's an area of conflict. But generally, he thinks that in his cultural politics, which is primarily a Judeo-Christian kind of approach to the world, India, which he perceives as a Hindu country, by the way, he repeatedly makes that point, India being a Hindu country, comes in that vision as a partner. But we cannot not expect the possibility of serious conflict in questions of immigration policy, trade, and tariff. So these are the issues in which his views and his policy measures could actually come in conflict with Indian interests and India's bilateral ties with the United States. But more importantly, I think what might cause or India will have to watch out for is his views and his what he does elsewhere, what he does vis-a-vis Russia, and Ukraine and Europe, what he does vis-a-vis China, what he does in the West Asia. These are questions, though, which are one can argue that they're not directly of a bilateral nature for India. It can actually cause significant spin-off effects in India's relations with this country. For example, his very harsh approach vis-a-vis Iran during his earlier term had forced actually India to bring down India's trade with Iran, India's plans for Chabahar port, etc. If Trump actually has a more conciliatory position with regard to Russia, that might be helpful for India. Marco Rubio, though he is a Russia hawk in many ways, he has indicated in his earlier public positions that though he is a Russia hawk, India's relationship with Russia should be allowed as a carve-out exemption in US ties with India. So those are so an overall possibility of improved ties between the US and Russia could actually come in to help slightly give India more leeway in managing that relationship. Same cannot be said about what the position that Trump would take in Israel. Last time he moved the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. This time again, it is likely to push that cultural agenda for the domestic audience in the United States in a manner that could actually create some kind of challenges for India to navigate. But most important of all things, I'm guessing at this point in time, is that how Donald Trump is going to manage the relations with China. In the last 4 years and the 4 years before that, during two presidencies, US ties with China have been on, overall, generally speaking, sliding down, and it remains a major challenge. There are China hawks within the administration. Will they actually instigate the anti-China instinct within Donald Trump's political thinking and push that confrontation into closer to an open conflict? We do not know. If, God forbid, if that's something that the world is confronted with, particularly on the question of Taiwan, I think India will have a difficult time managing India's own position in that kind of a world environment.
Trump is a bundle of contradictions, as you pointed out. He champions a Judeo-Christian cultural politics, but has one of large sections of American voters. He represents a break from the establishment. He has a different view of foreign policy, but we have to wait and see how Trump is going to manage these contradictions and whether he will be able to deliver on the promises he himself made to his voters. Thank you very much, Varghese, for joining Realpolitik.
Thank you
See
so
you again.
much. It was a fascinating discussion, and thank you for being here, allowing me to be here. Thank you.